Hello, my name is Laura Jeannie Newman. I am the co-founder of Flourish Co., an organization dedicated to helping students to learn how to flourish socially, emotionally, psychologically, and cognitively in learning and life. I've been an educator for over 30 years and have taught math at university and intermediate and senior levels. Over the years, as I witnessed an increasing number of math students feeling anxious and lacking confidence in their ability to be successful in math, I wondered what was at the root of these dispositions. What I found was fascinating to me. Students were not being empowered to think mathematically in an effective manner. Fascinating because I wondered how can anyone really learn math, let alone math well, in the absence of thinking. This discovery has taken me on a 10-year-long journey working on the development of a math approach to student learning focused on the building of student capacity to reason proficiently and independently in math. As I personally implemented and worked with thousands of math educators and teachers across the grades and around the world to implement this approach, I found strong and important connections to my expertise in economics and human behavior. I noticed that what was happening was that a reasoning-focused approach to math learning empowered students, gave them a voice in the learning process, and in turn created confidence and resilience accompanied by high levels of engagement and motivation. In the next 50 minutes, I would like to share with you the power of this approach through an exploration of social-emotional learning in math, or what I like to more generally refer to as flourishing. Before we continue, I'm going to turn off my video so that you can pay attention to the details on the slides. I'll come back on again at the end of the session just to say goodbye. Also, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples across this land. Together, we represent communities from all over Ontario. Before we get started, I would like to invite you to reflect on the territory from which you're joining us today, as I acknowledge the traditional land where Nelson's head office is located in Toronto and the traditional territories from where I'm located today in Caledon East. Nelson's head office is situated upon traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of Shugog, Hiawatha First Nation, Alderville First Nation, and the Métis Nation. The treaty covering this area of land is collectively known as the Williams Treaty of 1923. I am presenting today from Caledon East in Peel Region. This is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe nations, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land is also home of the Métis. I wish to recognize the significant contributions of Indigenous peoples across this great land. We seek a new relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, one based in honor and deep respect for their histories, languages, and distinct cultures. Their presence continues to enrich the vibrancy of all of our communities. Before we begin, please note that if you have any questions throughout this session, jot them down and send them to me by May 22nd. I will respond to them after the question session has closed. The words flourishing and well-being have become quite popular over the past few years. For example, in the context of math learning, most of us have heard of and have integrated the concept of growth mindsets into the day-to-day learning of our students. Learning coaches are now refocusing on flourishing and well-being. Ministries of education, districts, and schools are making it a priority, and more people are writing about it. Just go to the self-help section of the bookstore or Google the words social-emotional learning, well-being, or flourishing, and take a look at the topic list. Happiness, growth mindsets, mindfulness, meditation, healthy relationships, healthy living, and the list goes on and on. There is no shortage of information on this topic. But what's at the core of all these topics is what it means to have a flourishing mindset, a concept that a colleague and I have developed over the past few years in our study of positive psychology. We define a flourishing mindset as a way of thinking that underpins decision-making that is intentionally and consciously grounded in our desire to maximize our well-being, and particularly in our students' desire to maximize their success in math. Before we begin, let's take a moment to think about how a flourishing mindset may impact on your students' ability to be successful in math the most. How does your understanding of social emotional learning connect to the dimensions of a flourishing mindset? Take a minute or two to record these dimensions so that you have them handy for use in this session. As you think about the dimensions on this page, you may also have thought about other elements or dimensions, ones that you're familiar with. If you did so, jot those down as well. Many of you may be thinking, of course I want students to flourish in my math classrooms. Mathematical literacy is, after all, a fundamental life and professional competency. The question we really need to have answered is how. How do we do that? How do we cultivate a flourishing mindset in our students while in the process of learning math? The answer to this question is what I wish to begin to explore with you in this session. And I'd like to start by introducing 3 key words that drive the cultivation of a flourishing mindset. The first word, thoughtful, refers to classroom practices that help our students learn to make critically thoughtful decisions about how to grow their learning. Remember, a flourishing mindset is a thoughtful, intentional endeavor. The second word, empowering, refers to classroom practices that empower our students with the abilities to have agency. Agency means the free will and the power to independently flourish in the learning process. The third word, coaching, refers to classroom practices that teach our students how to coach themselves and others. Teachers and students, not just teachers, need to learn to coach. This is a transferable competency that is necessary to be able to flourish in learning and in all aspects of life. As you read through the summary of research on this page, you will notice that the cultivation of a flourishing mindset has well-documented benefits. When students learn with well-being in mind, their academic performance and their attitudes and behaviors improve, as do their social and emotional abilities. I am sure many of you are already doing much to cultivate a flourishing mindset in your students. Consider the following list of practices that many school teachers and principals have shared with me that identify how they do so. Feel free to add your ideas to this list, or simply record them for your own use later on in this session. Whatever you are doing to protect the well-being of your students and to help them flourish in school and life is cause for celebration. You are already doing such great things. You are helping your students feel a sense of belonging, and you are increasing your students' awareness on this topic. This is truly wonderful work. As you consider your list of practices, I invite you to think about which of the practices are an integral part of the day-to-day learning of your students. We all know how essential well-being is for our students, and for ourselves for that matter, to function effectively in learning and life. What sometimes is not made explicit to our students is that flourishing is dependent on these 3 important key elements I introduced earlier: the capacity for them to be critically thoughtful, the empowerment to do this thinking on their own, and the skills and competencies students need to coach themselves in their endeavor to learn and be well at the same time. Unfortunately, many of our students in many educational institutions, success in learning and well-being is a trade-off. You can't get one without sacrificing the other. But what if we made these 3 elements explicit in learning so that we could cultivate a flourishing mindset as an integral part of learning rather than as a sidebar to learning, and so that well-being and learning success complement each other? This is an idea that has been clearly endorsed by the Ministry of Education as it sits at the core of all math learning in our curriculum. Notice how social-emotional learning, or more broadly speaking, the cultivation of a flourishing mindset, is interwoven with the mathematical processes to support the learning of math content. And the thread that ties the two together is the empowering of our students with the capacity to make thoughtful learning decisions through the use of mathematical reasoning competencies related to the mathematical processes that end up guiding their coaching of self and others. I would like to invite you now to think prospectively, or to think in a future goal-oriented way, to imagine how we might cultivate a flourishing mindset in our students as an integral part of the learning process. Imagine what 5 years from now your classroom might look like if it cultivated a flourishing mindset. And more specifically, what might it look like if we focus on the dimensions of flourishing outlined in our curriculum documents by the Ontario Ministry of Education, which includes self-awareness, leveraging strengths, building healthy relationships, and critical and creative thinking. In a nutshell, let us explore how we might empower our students with a flourishing mindset in learning. And let's begin by exploring the meaning of flourishing in some historically and culturally inclusive ways. Let us first consider, with what we are probably most familiar, a Western perspective. According to the ancient Greeks, flourishing was defined as a state of being called eudaimonia, and eudaimonia was achieved through the possession of character virtues, or what today we refer to as character strengths. These include courage, honesty, patience, and so on. Take a moment and consider which of these virtues or character strengths are most important for successful and sustained learning in mathematics. If we help our students become character aware, that is, invite them to think about their character strengths or virtues, they will be better able to achieve eudaimonia or flourishing in their day-to-day learning in math. If interested, research-based surveys to help create this awareness can be found at the site posted on this slide. Take a moment to do the survey yourself. You might find it interesting. Or ask your students to do the survey so that they can highlight their character strengths or their virtues. Each of the following broad categories you see here of virtues plays a central role in our students' ability to be successful in math. It is important that our students are aware of these and that they can thoughtfully and intentionally leverage these strengths to support their math learning. In other words, we need to offer students the opportunity to think about how they may leverage these strengths as part of the learning process. And here are some of the responses we've heard from students. Notice how each of these students' learning thoughts and potential actions are built on something valuable they believe about themselves. For example, one student believes she is kind. This kindness can help her learn math more effectively, as she is naturally inclined to want to share her thinking with others, and in return is able to hear various perspectives on the quality of her thinking. She wonders, does her thinking make sense? Another student believes one of his virtues is his sense of humor. His sense of humor helps him find creative ways to recall important math facts. And yet another student believes he possesses the virtue of bravery, and this bravery allows him to take learning risks. Since these learning decisions are built on a sense of self-confidence, the things students believe are their strengths in themselves, students are more likely to be willing to take the risks associated with the actions they have suggested. It is important that we not only increase student awareness of their character strengths, but that we help them learn to leverage them by connecting them to empowering learning actions and decisions that they can make. Furthermore, our students need to develop coaching competencies that cultivate a flourishing mindset. Coaching practices such as modeling, deep listening, and goal setting can be built into the day-to-day instructional structures used by teachers. For example, teachers can model forgiveness of self and others, what it means to listen deeply, and goal setting by encouraging perspective and iterative thinking. Here the teacher begins the lesson with an enigmatic or puzzling problem, allows students to solve it, and then return to it following some collaborative learning to grow their response into something more thoughtful and extensive. We can also leverage and build on student strengths through the use of social-emotional learning collaborative strategies. On this slide, you will see two such examples taken from Nelson's newest math resources, My Math Path. Many of the examples shown in this presentation have come from that resource, and I encourage you to pause the video as needed and to check out the full examples in the sample pack at the end of this presentation. By providing students opportunities to think collaboratively, they live an experience that helps them realize and learn how to build their coaching capacities. They learn the power of asking impactful questions. That is, questions that positively impact on their learning. They learn the power of action-driven thinking, taking learning actions that align to the learning goal they are trying to achieve. They learn the power of listening deeply and showing appreciation when they get a new and useful idea. All of these empower each and every student's capacity to make thoughtful learning decisions in math and helps them recognize that learning takes time. It is not immediately perfect, and that others may have something useful to share in their learning. And throughout this process, each student maintains the agency to make this decision on their own in a way that serves their learning well. Collaborative strategies such as Ask Three Before Me, Think, Pair, Share, or Four Corners also encourage students to build their resilience by having them recognize that there is a wealth of resources available to them to access right in their classrooms, as long as they persevere and take the time to seek them. It also teaches them to be thoughtful about what information to use and not use to help them meet their personal learning goal in relation to the lesson learning goal that they have been introduced to. Finally, it is important to take the time to conceptually construct student understanding of concepts that underpin a flourishing mindset. Concepts such as kindness, compassion, gratitude, and forgiveness. Consider the time this takes as learning opportunities for your students to reason conceptually that they can then easily transfer to their own learning in math. By having students explore the meaning of these concepts through the use of conceptual reasoning strategies, in which students compare examples of these concepts to their opposites and then generalize their attributes, students learn the thinking process needed to construct their understanding of math concepts as well, and to be able to see relationships between these concepts. For example, they learn how to reason in a way that helps them identify the mathematical properties that define a square and a triangle and how they compare, or a linear and quadratic function and how they compare. Our math curriculums are full of mathematical concepts that students need to learn how to construct their understanding of through a conceptual reasoning process. Let us now move to an Indigenous view of flourishing. This view proposes that well-being is dependent on relationships and connections between all things. They say, if we see ourselves as connected to our relations, that is those who are like us and not like us, and those that are in nature, then the energy we create by making these connections will allow us to connect ourselves, others, and the planet. But how does the making of these connections translate to classroom learning? In the most obvious way, we need to invite our students to connect with each other and with nature. Since we already considered collaborative learning opportunities, let's think about how we can help our students connect with nature. Connecting with nature allows our students to see the beauty hidden in nature's secrets and the patterns in its behaviors and characteristics. In a less obvious way, these connections help our students learn how to savor the world and the experiences it has to offer as they learn math. The ability to savor is life-enhancing. It has a calming effect and as such reduces anxiety, the type of anxiety that many of our students experience in our math classrooms. It also helps our students naturally find purpose and meaning in their learning and lives as they consider how they fit and interact with the natural world in which they live. Meditation strategies also help our students learn how to savor. And done with math learning in mind, meditation doesn't have to be taught in isolation of this math learning. For example, we can invite our students to use their senses to fully experience any context, whether in nature or not. This makes me think of a time when I worked with a class of grade 1 students. I asked them how pleasing they thought the geometric shapes that are found as foam pieces in a play pit might be. The shapes shown in a picture that I shared with them of a play pit were round, triangular, or square. As they explored the various shapes in their imagination through the use of some of their senses, for example, feeling, seeing, tasting, they were better able to describe the mathematical properties of these shapes and decide to what degree each of them created a pleasing or an unpleasing sensation. They were in turn better able to decide which shape should be used in a play pit in order to make it a pleasing and fun experience. In the end, they had an aha moment as it came to them why play pits typically contained round-shaped balls, and hence they came to realize the term ball pit. The strategy of visualization involves a similar process. It involves looking at an image and bringing it to life using all of the senses. When students explore an object or a problem in math, encouraging them to think about what the problem or the object might look like, sound like, and behave like when it comes to life helps them better understand it as they savor it and pay attention to everything that defines it. And although using the 5 senses in nature is a good place to start, it actually helps students learn to engage in detailed-minded reasoning in math classrooms. It helps students learn to pay attention to details, to all the small little things that define and help us understand different parts of our world. This carries itself into the classroom as students begin to see math learning as special, a gift that teaches them the importance of paying attention to all details, and to be discerning and thoughtful about these details when seeking to understand or solve problems. In essence, it helps our students learn how to reason soundly in mathematics. Finally, let's consider the Buddhist view of flourishing and how it helps cultivate a flourishing mindset in our math students. Buddhists are well known for their ability to achieve the highest level of well-being possible through meditation. This view focuses on the importance of self-awareness. Mathieu Richard, a Buddhist monk who resides in a monastery in Nepal, places self-awareness at the core of flourishing. He describes, and I quote, it as a deep sense of serenity and fulfillment, a state that underlies and pervades all emotional states, all the joys and sorrows in our lives. He offers an absolutely beautiful analogy to capture this idea. He describes it like that of an ocean. At the surface, he says, the ocean may be calm and flat like a mirror, or it may be stormy and turbulent with high waves, but at its depths, there is a predictable constant. This constant is our self-awareness. So to flourish, he advises, we must look deep inside of ourselves. We must know ourselves and what truly defines us so that this constant allows us to stay well, both in times of joy and success and in times of sorrow or when we face significant challenges. If you would like, take some time to watch this TED Talk and think about how self-awareness might play a role in math learning. Practice visualization yourself as you imagine what our math classrooms would look like if our students all felt this way about themselves while learning math. Let's now get back to the how. How might we build self-awareness in your students? As we all know, ensuring our students know themselves as learners, such as their learning styles or preferences, is important. To some extent, we all pay attention to this, whether it is using learning style tests, creating learner profiles, or simply through observation. But how important is it that we cultivate a broader sense of student awareness so that it is useful and valuable to them in their learning and beyond? For example, how often do we ask our students to examine who they truly and authentically are while they are in the process of learning math? Cultivating a broader, or what I call an insightful self-awareness in our students, in which they explore their actions, emotions, thoughts, attitudes, and passions in the learning process, or where they think about how they are perceived by others and if it matches how they see themselves, or if they think about what is working for them and what is not, how their math learning fits into their worldview, or what they hope to achieve. These are all very important. This is essentially because as students examine themselves through their learned experiences, in other words, how they respond in the learning process, they increase their self-awareness and are empowered with a self-knowledge that helps them to navigate their own learning and the decisions they need to make to effectively grow that learning. And again, how do we cultivate learning self-awareness in our students? We do it by taking one simple but very powerful action. We do it by putting reflective reasoning at the core of all learning in mathematics. What is reflective learning, and how do we help our students learn to reflect in a productive manner? First of all, we provide students with the opportunity to reflect forward, not simply look back on what they've already done. Reflecting back on past mistakes and weaknesses without thinking forward on how to change these and make a difference not only teaches our students to ruminate unhealthily on the things that they can't change, but it creates a negative learning stance, one focused on judgment and failure instead of on productive change and positive growth. Secondly, in the same way we provide students with guiding criteria on how to reason soundly in math so that they learn how to do that effectively, we can provide students with guiding criteria for productive reasoning or reflective reasoning. These include having our students routinely questioning and adjusting their learning by 1. Carefully comparing new learning to past learning to move their learning forward, 2. Selecting appropriate and helpful new learned mathematical ideas, concepts, and ways of thinking, those that they've come up with on their own or have come up with from others. Thirdly, replacing the use of past mathematical ideas, concepts, and ways of thinking with better ones that are more appropriate, accurate, efficient, and useful. And fourthly, checking to make sure their learning and responses, even when they're reflecting, are sound. There are several practices that we can use to explicitly teach our students how to become strong reflective reasoners in math, a competency that they will then be able to transfer to situations beyond the learning context. What are those practices? Let's explore a few. The first set of practices support self-awareness. The ability to be self-aware lays the foundation for all other components of a flourishing mindset. In the absence of this awareness, students are unable to be intentional and conscious about how to optimize their learning and their well-being. With a resurging focus on well-being that has come with increasing levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, it makes sense that self-awareness is now considered the meta skill of the 21st century. Thousands of people worldwide have taken this pledge to self-awareness over the past year alone, revealing their desire, particularly desire of young people between the ages of 16 to 28, to become more self-aware. Consider this pledge from a learner's perspective in math. Students would say to themselves, I pledge to devote time and energy to my journey of learning self-awareness. I pledge to discover who I am, what I want, and what matters most to me as I learn math. I pledge to have the courage to seek feedback on my own terms. This pledge exemplifies the practices we as teachers need to focus on to help our students balance high achievement with well-being. The importance of self-awareness is made clear in this TED Talk by psychologist and researcher Tasha Eurich. Eurich makes an impressive case for why we should teach our students how to become more self-aware. She urges us to reflect on how we are reflecting. Remember what I earlier said? We need to put reflective reasoning at the core of all learning in math. Why? Well, first, because self-awareness has a significant impact on our well-being and success in math. Secondly, few of us are genuinely self-aware. Eurich's research shows that only 10 to 15% of us are self-aware. The rest of us, she says, are delusioned. Given these figures, this is most definitely a 21st century competency we need to build in our students. Again, if you have time, I highly recommend watching the TED Talk highlighted on this slide or reading Tasha's recently published book, Insight: The Surprising Truth About How Others See Us, How We See Ourselves, and Why Answers Matter More Than We Think. Urich goes on to talk about how we can all learn to become more self-aware. She calls it her simple fix. This is what she says. At the core of self-awareness is learning. Learning, first characterized by a flexible mindset that is not in search of absolute truths that are immovable, but rather flexible understanding. In other words, let us not waste our time in math classrooms and the time of our students searching for truths others have spent centuries finding. We need to find truths that are specific to context and purpose, to us and our life experiences, to truths that are authentic. This is what authentic learning is all about. It is also learning characterized by the asking of questions that help us see a better path forward in our learning and not focused on the asking of why. Remember, why fixes us in the past, a past already lived that cannot be changed. We want learning to focus on the future, where there is time to adapt, and focused on getting better so that our students can achieve learning growth. And it is learning that is focused on a mindset of the achievement of improvement, quality, not quantity, not the highest grade in the class, but the most empowering set abilities needed for success in math learning. Urich's simple fix has several important implications for learning in math. The first is that school, more specifically the math classroom, is the best place to learn introspection if it requires prospection, ongoing forward reflection about ourselves as learners for success in math. As long as we provide math learning experiences to students that allow them to reflect forward, they can take the time needed to develop their self-awareness. In a learning context, this translates to a series of sequenced lessons focused on the future goal of dealing with a complex problem or issue. It requires perspective thinking or goal-oriented thinking. And this is what this might look like. It begins with the positioning of a culminating end of lesson or unit question or task at the beginning of the learning process rather than at the end. For example, when the question or task takes the form of a mathematical reasoning question or task. This reasoning can be aligned with any of the mathematical processes, but let's consider the process of representing and representational reasoning, the thinking behind this process. Here is an example of 3 different ways to represent a mathematical idea: concretely, pictorially, or abstractly. Does each accurately and effectively communicate the same idea? This is a question we rarely ask our students to think about, and yet it is at the crux of making connections between mathematical representations. So next time you invite your students to explore multiple ways of representing a mathematical idea, invite them first to answer the question, how well do all of these representations show or describe the same idea? For example, the idea of fractions, quadrilaterals, increasing linear patterns. The concepts go on and on and on. In other words, what we need to do is start learning immediately by asking students to put their thinking caps on. Put their thinking caps on right away before they engage in the learning process. In addition to framing a rich, complex problem at the start of learning, offer students a problem that aligns to this problem but highlights the thinking needed by students to successfully solve the problem. This second problem, what I like to refer to as the launch problem, although directly related to the unit or lesson problem, provides students an opportunity to make a conjecture, prediction, speculation, or initial response and to muck about with their thinking to solve the bigger problem in a way that allows them to iteratively return to it following their exploration of a range of representational forms. In this situation, students connect these forms and they go back to those connections to either affirm, revise, or change their thinking. As a result, their thinking over time, their representational reasoning, improves. Note that this problem, unlike the complex unit or lesson problem, must be both immediately accessible to all students, but also push the thinking of every student in your classroom. This is how we begin by differentiating learning for our students. It also creates a healthy dose of success for all of our students and motivates them to sustain their learning while at the same time challenging them to persevere. A thinking space is essential for all learners as they work through this process, as they muck about through their learning. This space, such as a math journal, offers students opportunity to reflect forward in a productive manner by iteratively returning to their initial thinking to check the quality of that thinking and to either affirm their initial thinking and extend it with new mathematical learning, or to modify their initial thinking and provide more accurate, appropriate, and useful math learning to support their changes. Remember, though, a thinking space such as a math journal will only cultivate a flourishing mindset if it continues to grow student success by being a space that holds the student's ever-evolving learning, no matter how big or small that learning may be. Small experiences of continued learning growth is at the center of student confidence, perseverance, motivation, and drive. So we have to balance success and challenge to effectively engage our learners. For those of you who are interested, take a closer look at Csikszentmihalyi's foundational work on flow. Take a look at this example of gradual release and how it supports achievement. Notice also how this iterative process of sequenced learning designed to scaffold student thinking supports this gradual release of learning that personalizes student learning and learning growth. Remember as well that for these practices to cultivate a flourishing mindset, they must support reflective reasoning that is perspective in nature. If our students' learning experiences come from invitations to seek the best answer rather than a single correct answer, this will transfer this type of reasoning to their reflective practices as well. This means learning that is framed in a way that requires the making of the best decisions possible on how to think and act through the consideration of alternatives, guiding criteria, and authentic evidence. This will help students generate perspective reflective questions such as, is practicing an important part of learning something new? How do you know? What evidence do you have? Is it helpful to learn different ways to solve a problem? How do you know? What learning evidence do you have? What strategies most helped you decide where to put each number on the number line? Again, how do you know? What evidence do you have that they were helpful? Finally, how important is it to learn to communicate mathematical ideas clearly? Notice that these are focused on improving student self-awareness as students come to understand what helps their learning best. They also build a student's capacity to think and reason effectively. This is how students learn to make reflective decisions that support their learning journeys well, a requirement for self-awareness that researcher Tasha Eurich also notes in her work. Also note how these questions invite students to think critically in the process of their math learning. They are making learning assessments of the different ways of learning guided by what is important, helpful, or clear. Students need to use evidence of their mathematical learning. Remember how I asked, how do you know, or what evidence do you have of this after each question? And they need guiding criteria so that they can effectively assess if their learning strategies are indeed helpful, important, or that their communication is clear. In summary, for insightful self-awareness to take place in our math classrooms in the context of learning, we need to move from rumination, a place where students are fixated on their fear of failure, their shortcomings, and their insecurities, to introspection, a place where students can thoughtfully examine their thoughts, feelings, motives, actions, and behaviors in a productive way that will support their learning in math. But this can only happen if we remove criticism and judgment from the learning process. This is because criticism creates a sense of hopelessness and learned helplessness in students, and judgment, although not always bad and at times necessary, implies an end to learning. So it's only necessary when learning is at its end. When judgments take place before the end of a lesson or unit, students interpret this as, the learning is over. There's nothing more I can do to make a difference. Judgments remove the capacity for students to develop a flourishing mindset. Before the session comes to a close, let's take a quick look at what is at the core of building positive relationships for our students in math classrooms. Our students are wired to be social, to be with and relate to others. This wiring influences our capacity to flourish, our ability to make it through difficult times. The quality of our lives and our ability to learn both depend on it. Here are a list of factors that shape the quality of relationships. Which of these do you think has the most significant impact on positive relationship building? Take a moment and jot them down if you would like. Interestingly, trust is at the core of flourishing relationships. Here are some trust-building practices for you to consider. Notice how each practice aligns to the creation or modeling of thoughtful, empowering coaching. The 3 key elements of a flourishing mindset I introduced earlier in the session and that you've seen pop up throughout the session. Here are a few examples of how you might do that. Invite your students to scrutinize your ideas and justify your decisions and choices openly with your students to help them learn what it means to be critically thoughtful in the math learning process. Secondly, respect student desires of if, when, and how to share the ideas in their thinking spaces. Or, show confidence by not pretending to know everything. Share what or how you worked hard to learn instead. This helps your students learn what it means to be empowered. Thirdly, give relevant, specific, just-in-time feedback guided by a common shared set of criteria. This encourages your students to point out your mistakes or to improve on your suggestions for feedback. Alternatively, you may wish to support risk-taking by abstaining from judging your students' thinking and work during the learning process. This helps your students learn some important coaching competencies. Remember to leave your judgments only to when you are reporting on student achievement. In short, we build trust and positive relationships when we empower our students with the capacity to make flourishing learning choices. When we make assessment about guidance and the primary purpose of math learning be about each student serving themselves well in the learning process so that they can actually experience success in their math learning. We are now full circle back to my initial question. I hope that you are able to see the multiple ways that you can help your students learn and experience the foundations of flourishing in the many hours of math learning in our classrooms. Doing so will enable your students to transfer these thinking competencies to all aspects of their lives, including in their math learning. Our goal is to empower our students with the capacity to flourish no matter what they are doing, no matter who they are working with, and no matter where their life takes them. Before we close, let's revisit this list. What might your list look like now? Has it grown? Is it different? Would you choose any different practices? Would you add or replace some? Are your practices focused on maximizing learning through well-being rather than forcing a choice between one or the other? Too many of our students suffer mentally, socially, and psychologically at the expense of high achievement. And at the same time, too many of our students suffer academically because they make the wise choice to take care of themselves and their relationships. Using a few powerful practices that I highlighted in this session will allow all of your students to flourish at no cost to their achievement or well-being. And most importantly, do your social emotional learning practices that you have chosen to use with your students support the cultivation of a flourishing mindset? Do they explicitly and continuously invite your students to be thoughtful, empowered coaches of themselves and others? As mentioned earlier, many of the examples throughout this presentation come from Nelson's newest math resource for grades 1 to 8, My Math Path. My Math Path is fully aligned to the new 2020 Ontario curriculum and puts a special focus on social emotional learning, with robust support for both teachers and students. If you head over to the URL on this slide, you'll gain access to your exclusive OME 2021 sample pack. It includes excerpts from the Social Emotional Learning Toolkit for all grades, so be sure to check it out. There's some pretty awesome materials there. To close, I'd like to leave you with one final learning tip. Celebrate your achievements and those of your students, no matter how big or small you believe them to be. Remember that you and your students are everyday champions. Think about the challenges that you and your students have overcome during COVID. If you're capable of doing that, you're capable of ensuring that your students are cultivating a flourishing mindset, and your students are most certainly capable of flourishing and achieving success in their math classrooms. Thank you for taking the time to learn how to cultivate a flourishing mindset in your students. May your day, week, year take the best path to flourishing possible. Thank you. Please don't forget to share your questions or comments. We want to hear from you. And complete the session evaluation by simply going to this link.